Hello, everybody, to this Tile Network webinar. I'm excited to have Dr. Chiara Horlin and Dr. Elliott Spaeth here today to talk about supporting neurodiversity in education. I will give a short bio overview of our two amazing speakers today, and then I'm going to hand over. So Dr. Chiara Horlin is a neurodivergent lecturer within the School of Psychology and Neuroscience at the University of Glasgow, who has previously held lectureships and postdoctoral fellowships within universities and hospitals in Australia and Canada. Chiara's teaching and research focus centers on the lived experience of neurodivergent adults and their support networks, with a particular emphasis on neurodiversity in higher education and the workplace. Other areas of research include the experience of neurodivergent girls, women, and gender minorities, masking and camouflaging chronic illnesses and eustress, and the positive mental health benefits of risk-taking. Our second speaker is Dr. Elliott Spaeth. He is a lecturer and senior advisor in academic and digital development at the University of Glasgow. This primarily involves working with new lecturers to develop their teaching practice. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology and music and is passionate about combining expertise in the areas of mental health and pedagogy to promote inclusive learning and teaching environments. He is disabled, trans, and neurodivergent. Welcome, both of you, and I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Carolina. I'm going to start us off. I wanted to start by saying thank you for having us speak today. And I'll start with a caveat as well that Elliott and I are experts in our own experience. We have some knowledge in what we're going to talk about today, but this is not exhaustive. And we'd be really happy, particularly if we have neurodivergent students with us or neurodivergent educators or support staff who would like to share their experience in the chat, please absolutely do. And obviously in the question time as well. So let me find my screen and hopefully I don't blow up my computer. This is going to be in Prezi, so if you get seasick, I apologize in advance. I'll try not to make the transitions too fast. Are we good? Can we see? Fabulous.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm aware that we probably have a lot of people here that already know what neurodiversity is and neurodivergence is, but just to make sure that everybody is kind of on the same level playing field, I want to start with a little overview of what neurodiversity is. And you can see at the bottom of this screen, there is a link tree. This is something that we have used to share some resources that we're going to talk about today, as well as a bunch of other resources that you might find useful as well. So feel free to go through that a little bit later. So neurodiversity is a recognition that not all people think or feel in the same way. The emphasis as part of this neurodiversity movement, which was first mentioned by Judy Singer, is really an emphasis of difference rather than disorder or deficits. This is kind of shifting this conversation that historically has focused on this very medicalized, disordered, impairment-based approach to these kinds of conditions and diagnosis. But it's important to note that this is not a denial that there are very real challenges and barriers that people may experience. So it's not completely obliterating the fact that there are some difficulties that people experience, but it's reframing the conversation of this to emphasize a difference in natural variations in the human genome in terms of how we think and how we feel. It's also a term that is used as an umbrella for a number of different kinds of conditions. But just a little note on language before we go further. This is something that there's a little bit of nuance, and language is constantly evolving. So it's always good to be aware and to always reflect on whether your language is the most up to date really of what we're using, what the community is preferring. So neurodiversity represents an entire group that includes both neurotypical and neurodivergent people, or neuroatypical is sometimes used in the same way as neurodivergent. For some people within the neurodivergent community, identity first language is very important, not necessarily for every condition that we will talk about necessarily, but for some, identity first is very, very important. So for an example, autistic person rather than person with autism. The community also prefers that we avoid medicalized language. So we're talking about conditions rather than disorder. We're talking about differences rather than impairments or deficits. And even things like symptoms we avoid, and we can talk about things like traits instead. Other things to try and avoid as this kind of language evolves is words like high functioning versus low functioning. And sometimes colloquially, you'll hear people say, you know, everyone's a little bit autistic and those kinds of things, which, yeah, there's a whole discussion around these kinds of things. So always ask if in doubt. When we talk about this umbrella of conditions and diagnoses, this list is also evolving, but we're traditionally talking about autism, ADHD, specific learning differences like dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, and the discussion is also expanding to things like Tourette's, anxiety, other specific language differences, and fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and more as we go through. So in terms of what neurodivergence looks like, I want to preface this by saying that you're never going to really know unless someone tells you. In terms of the population prevalence, we're talking roughly 1 in 60 people receive an autism diagnosis, but there is some discussion that this is really, well, all of these are severely underestimated, but autism specifically, we've often thought of as the people that get diagnosed are about 50% of the people that are probably autistic. So already the numbers that we see formally are not really going to be reflective of the actual population. ADHD, we're probably talking around 3 to 4 in every 100. That is very likely going to be higher for reasons that we'll talk about in a second. For Tourette's, 1 in 100, and so on for dyspraxia, dyslexia, and so on. And anxiety is obviously one of the things that's really quite common.
Chiara, we've got a question about whether that's in the UK specifically or if that's worldwide, these numbers.
These are UK specific, but they're fairly reflective in terms of Western countries. Obviously, outside of English-speaking Western countries, the numbers look slightly different. The other thing I want to note as well is that even for people that might be in some way familiar with some of these conditions, your preconceptions of what these conditions look like, on what experiences these people have, is very likely to be stereotyped and very likely to be biased just because of our historical understanding of these conditions generally being a little bit flawed or inaccurate. One of the things that is really important to point out, and this conversation is still happening, but historically we've been very bad and very narrow in how we recognize a lot of these conditions, and then of course in how we support them, particularly when we are bringing in gender and gender minorities, and race and culture as well is going to very much impact our ability to interpret diagnostic criteria that were designed on a very, very narrow set and presentation of behavioral phenotypes. And this results in a lot of misdiagnosis, particularly girls and women will be diagnosed with perhaps affective disorders or borderline instead of potentially an ADHD or an autism diagnosis, being primary diagnosis. A lot of misdiagnosis, people never ever getting diagnosed formally, and also late diagnosis, people not being detected and not being supported in their earlier years, but this potentially being picked up as situations change, going to university, leaving university, or going into employment. And those kind of big life transitions are opportunities for some people to, then be matching diagnostic criteria that they might not previously have matched very closely. We do know that a lot of the accommodations and adjustments that are in place, either in schools, universities, or the workplace, are limited and are quite inflexible, and so don't necessarily support people that even are identified. And there is a lot of stigma, either in internalized stigma, a lot of othering behaviors, and there is very little culture, something that we're trying to change, that welcomes disclosure and discussion of these kinds of conditions. So these are some of the challenges that people are experiencing. And really, if you're not familiar with the terms masking and camouflaging, these are really, really important phenomena in terms of understanding the experience of neurodivergent people. So some people learn and practice certain behaviors, or they may suppress other behaviors to appear neurotypical, to pass, to either be undetectable in social situations, or to actively participate in a way that isn't necessarily their natural kind of inclination to. And this has a multitude of different impacts. The first is that if this starts very young and a child adopts these behaviors or suppresses behaviors, it can limit their ability to be detected for diagnosis and thus receive support. Internally within the individual, it can be associated with additional fatigue, harm to self-identity, depression, anxiety, and in some cases, thoughts of suicidal ideation. And a sometimes uncomfortable conversation for families and for practitioners is that some interventions may unknowingly teach or encourage these kinds of behaviors. Some people within the community don't mind having this flexibility, even with the additional toll it takes on them. But ultimately, it's something that we would hope people didn't feel that they had to do, and that we didn't force on people to have to do. So this is just something to be really mindful of in terms of the additional pressures that neurodivergent people have to experience. There we go. I thought we were going to freeze there for a second. So in terms of the kinds of traits that you might see within neurodivergent populations, this list is not exhaustive. And it's quite long because neurodivergent conditions are very heterogeneous. Even within conditions, there's such a variety of presentations and experiences that people have, different strengths and different challenges. This is by no means going to be exhaustive. But what you'll see potentially are differences in how people learn and how they think, how they might listen. Elliott and I know what listening can look like very differently in neurodivergent people compared to neurotypical people. What might be inattentive is actually very much paying attention, and vice versa. In terms of memory, in terms of reading, communication, shout out to Catherine Compton, who I saw is here and who has done some excellent work in differences between neurotypical and neurodivergent people in terms of how they communicate. What organization looks like. Sensitivity to change will look very different. Sensory experiences on a multitude of different levels, hyper versus hypo. Differences in working patterns and in energy patterns, emotion regulation, how people react to different situations, positive feedback, negative feedback, physical contact, and how people express themselves physically as well. All of these things and more will potentially be different. One of the things that's really important to note as well is that context is really important here. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when Elliott talks about universal design, but the idea of disability can be very situationally specific and very contextualized in certain situations. And navigating the neurotypical world is really where challenges might arise that don't necessarily need to be there. So a neurodivergent person might be entirely fine and capable, but in certain situations that might change. barriers might arise and challenges might be experienced. And traditional education systems can be, at best, one of the challenges, and at worst, very traumatizing for some people. Some of the challenges and barriers that can be experienced within classrooms, whether they are early years, senior school, or in higher education, is an inflexibility in procedures, administrations within curriculums, inaccessible materials on a variety of different levels that can be inaccessible, unclear communications, a lack of clarity for expectations as well. You may know already with autism, literality can be one of those things. Inconsistencies in information and inconsistencies in actions and behaviors as well can be very confusing for neurodivergent people. Hidden meanings and assumed knowledge, I think they're difficult for everybody, but particularly different for neurodivergent people. And both explicit and implicit biases, particularly in terms of expectations that educators might have for neurodivergent people. And obviously, as stereotypes and a lack of awareness are going to be very difficult as well. But alongside these kinds of challenges, neurodivergent people offer a huge variety of strengths within their educational experiences. They bring, as either students or educators, I want to highlight that too, huge amounts of creativity, unique insight. Thinking differently can provide different ideas and different opportunities that neurotypical people may just not have thought of. Really infectious passions. Anybody that talks to me about Game of Thrones will know that for me. Focused and inexhaustible interests, even an ability to do otherwise boring tasks or repetitive tasks for hours on end that neurotypical people might be exhausted by within minutes. A strong degree of independence for some people, an ability to be very direct and forward and forthright with conversations, honesty and reliability as well. So I think, Elliott, I'm going to keep driving, but Elliott will take over the wheel of conversation.
Do you want to do the stats first, Chiara? Because I know you popped them in.
Yes, I can do this. So these statistics are specifically for the UK that we'll talk about. They are predominantly England and Scotland. They measure things slightly differently. I can't find specific statistics for Wales or Ireland, but I'm going to assume that they're going to be very much the same. But we know within the past decade or so, there's been a sharp increase in the prevalence of neurodivergent conditions within UK schools. And these students are then obviously going to move to higher education. So we're really talking about the spectrum of educational institutions here. And around 17% of students that move to higher education share and disclose a disability diagnosis. Of those 17%, about 35 to 40% are sharing ADHD or a specific learning difference. And around 3 to 5% are disclosing an autism diagnosis. Again, I want to emphasize this is likely an underestimation. Some students choose never to disclose for a number of reasons. Either they don't think they need to, they don't want to, they want to do it on their own without support or assistance, or they don't feel safe. They don't feel comfortable to share that information because they think they'll experience stigma or bias from staff or other students as well. So again, this is a lower boundary estimate, absolutely. What this kind of means is a lot of these students aren't necessarily getting the support that they need. Even the ones that do share and disclose might not be getting the kind of individualized, tailored support they need to succeed in higher education, particularly with that shift from high school. Completion rates in higher education are lower for disabled students, but they are lower still for autistic students. We know this. Despite having intact, if not superior, intellectual abilities in some areas and very focused interests and things like this, there's still something that isn't working for these students. So I think, Elliott, are you happy to take over here?
I am. So the question is, why is this happening? And the way that we're framing it here isn't that those students have some sort of inherent impairment or deficit that means that they wouldn't be able to succeed in higher education. Instead, it's more that the environment isn't always that supportive. And one theory as to why that is something that's known as the implied student, which is written about by Ulrichsen in 2009 and since, which is the idea that when educators are planning teaching, we're often being very student-centered, which is great. We're thinking about how we're expecting students to respond. But in doing so, we are inevitably imagining a student based on our own experiences of either being a student or of those people that we've seen most in higher education. And due to power structures in place, those people are most likely to be non-marginalized people. And in that case, it means that people are most likely to be neurotypical, or at least the person that we're imagining is most likely to be neurotypical. And so when we are designing activities, we're designing them in a way where a neurotypical person is more likely to succeed. And my job is working with educators, and every so often someone says, oh, well, yes, but we have standards. We have to maintain these standards. You know, we can't lower our expectations, and people have got to be aware of the real world. I hear a lot of those sorts of things. And in my opinion, we're not talking at all about lowering expectations. We're just talking about being aware that our existing expectations and standards might be quite biased towards neurotypical people. That's the default. The default is thinking that the way that we do things for neurotypical people is the way that everyone should cope with it. And that idea that society really caters more for neurotypical people is known as a neuronormative approach. So yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide. Another thing my students often say is it's okay because I get a list from disability services with the students that have disclosed a disability or a neurodivergent condition, which is often true. But unfortunately, that doesn't end all of the things that we need to think about how to teach in a way that is really inclusive of and embracing of neurodivergent people. And some of the reasons for this are things that Chiara has already touched on. So part of it is you can't possibly know whether you have neurodivergent people in your classroom. It might be that somebody is on your list, but that's probably a very small minority of people that actually are impacted by these traits. So there might be students that don't even realize they have a diagnosis. I personally wasn't diagnosed until I was 26 with autism and ADHD because I guess my coping mechanisms I had a lot of anxiety, so my coping mechanisms involved things that made me do very well at school. And so it didn't really come out until the stress of my PhD was just too much for me. And it's quite difficult to get diagnosed as an adult. And because of the reasons that Chiara's already talked about, in that there is one picture of autism that is often considered the only type of autism by those who are making diagnoses, when in fact, the way that autism presents is much, much more varied than that. And so there might be students that don't realize that they are neurodivergent, or they probably think they are, but they haven't been able to get a diagnosis because of that problem within the medical system. Similarly, anyone who's dealt with marginalization is probably familiar with the concept of trying to ask someone to have your needs met and potentially being told that it's not important or being dismissed because it's not what the majority of people would like. And once you've had that happen to you a few times, it can be quite difficult to continue asking for help and informing people about your differences or your conditions. And to be honest, at that point, it can often feel like I don't want to tell another person because I just can't face being told by yet one more person that my needs aren't important. And so by only responding to those people that have actually had enough privilege in some respects to disclose, we're massively gatekeeping who gets help and support. And this means that we're making changes for a very small amount of people who may feel singled out as well, when in fact, there's a whole lot more people that could benefit from things being different. Go ahead, Chiara. So there's quite some interesting research that's shortly to be published. Currently, there is a preprint available by Von Bello, Spaeth, and Horlin, that's Chiara. And this was looking into the opinions, awareness, and practices of educators when working with autistic students. And there's this idea that if we can just increase awareness about, in this case, autism and how it manifests and how autistic students would learn, then it will improve things. But what this study found was that awareness isn't always enough to overcome those barriers. So what this study found, which was qualitative interviews, was that there were educators in higher education institutions who actually knew quite a lot about autism. They understood the concept that you couldn't possibly know if somebody were autistic just by talking to them or interacting with them. They were really aware of those things, and yet there was actually quite a big gap between those awarenesses and their actual practice. So the same person that was saying, oh, you know, it's fine, I know that you couldn't possibly know whether somebody were autistic necessarily unless they told you, then later said, well, I've never had an autistic student in my class, but if I did have one, obviously I would do things differently. And of course the issue there is they might have had many autistic people in their class and they wouldn't necessarily know. So there's a couple of quotes from it that I'm just going to read out. They're also on the screen. The first is, we consider inclusive communication and inclusive teaching to be good practice for absolutely everybody anyway, so it's never a challenge for us, which is a really positive perspective to have. And so we've got something else here, you know, it really is going over and above, and we do it, but it is really challenging trying to do that kind of teaching. So there's a bit of a conflict there. And then similarly there, so they being autistic students, contributions are welcome, but they do present a challenge for teaching. Was that all the same participant, Chiara?
Yeah.
Yeah. So just suggesting that I think Chiara and I, as Chiara mentioned at the beginning, are both proponents of the idea that inclusive practice is very much a journey, and what's important is to try and be respectful and not be dismissive of people's needs. But we're both aware that we're sure that we teach in ways that some people find uninclusive. And for me, and I'm sure Chiara as well, it's just about listening and being open to changing if things aren't working for people. And just think it's important to say that here, it's not that we expect everyone to be perfect and have come here to criticize anyone that isn't. It's just interesting to highlight that difference between in the same person's thinking in quite conflicting ways.
Yeah, and a lot of the challenges that we're talking about are from the individual educator with the system, not with the student. And that's where the challenge might lie, particularly.
That's a really good point, yes, which does sort of bring us on to our next point, I think. So let's go to the next slide.
Yep. So this was about the what we've learned from the pivot as well.
Yes.
I can do this one, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
We've both got insight to this from quite different perspectives as well, but
you first, then I'll go.
Sure. Well, really one of the lessons that we've had from the pivot is that a lot of the things that we've really held on to within higher education, we don't need to hold on to based on tradition. And you can see below some of the bullet points at the bottom half of this circle have come from some recent dissertation research looking at the experiences of neurodivergent students studying through the pivot. And really the fact that they've benefited from this flexibility of materials and accessibility and structure, but that does have to be balanced with some level of structure to help people regulate their learning and to have accountability as well. It's also highlighted that we can remove environmental barriers like traveling to university, lecture halls, noisy, sensory overloading context within the university environment as well. But the flip side of this is that sense of belonging and needing a community and wanting interaction just as much as neurotypical students might as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the fact that people have been forced to change from that default assumption of how things have always been done, which, as we've already discussed, sometimes can really disadvantage neurodivergent students, has meant that some of those choices are things that might actually work out better for some neurodivergent students in some ways. But also, as Chiara said, that's not to say that all changes due to responses to the pandemic have been universally positive for neurodivergent students. Like anything else, there are things that some people find really helpful. There are some things that people find much more difficult, but really it's about changing the conversation so that the default choice isn't always the one that best suits the people that are most privileged and least marginalized. It has very much shown that actually there are other options that are possible now. And I think as a disabled person, I have concerns, not specifically for higher education, but just in general, that now that marginalized people might be coming back to being a larger percentage of the people that need these changes, that they might go back to not being possibilities. So if anyone's in charge of those sorts of decisions, then it's good to keep in mind that they are helpful for people, and sometimes actually having different options can be really positive. And if nothing else, I think the pandemic has certainly taught us that different people can have strongly different preferences, such as the response to home working. Some people love it, some people hate it. Sometimes that's due to personal preferences. Sometimes that's due to environmental factors, like having other people around. So there's been a lot to learn from it, really, hasn't there?
Okay, on to inclusive practice. I'm happy to take this first one, if you like.
Yeah, go for it, absolutely.
We have a very collaborative relationship. Feel free to jump in and whenever. So the conversation now shifts to what can we do to really support neurodivergent students. And not to be reductive, but I have tried to cluster these under a few different kind of sentiments. And the first is the sense of community, but the sense of a neurodivergent community, and that being visible and acknowledged by neurotypical people as well. One of the ways that we can do this, and Elliott and I do this as well as educators and as staff members, is sharing our own experiences. So welcoming disclosure by leading by example is one example of doing that. We can also talk about this in terms of classroom culture and supporting the potential of individual students, but also by looking at curriculum and celebrating diversity within the curriculum as well. So we've kind of roughly broken this into what individuals can do regardless of roles within education systems. And that's really talking about awareness, acceptance, but more than that, celebration, not just acknowledging that these things exist, but actually celebrating their contribution to the global society. One of the things that people can do as individuals is to be educated specifically by the neurodiversity or the neurodivergent community. So in terms of, staff training, teacher training, or consultations, having those actually led by neurodivergent people is absolutely vital in every situation. Supporting self-advocacy as well, encouraging students, encouraging peers to feel like they can ask for what they need to get that support, and they're in a safe environment to do so. And if you don't really know how to help a student, ask them what they might need. That's really the first step. And you can also ask the wider community. We have the Neurodiversity Network at Glasgow, but there are other social media networks out there that are very active and very helpful. As like any social media, sometimes they're slightly toxic and slightly exhausting as well. But there are, specific hashtags that you can use to ask for autistic advice or ADHD Twitter and Reddit and all of these different mediums. If in doubt, ask the community itself. Encourage, but don't expect disclosure, because it might not be something that people feel safe doing. And just accommodate anyway as much as you possibly can. And one of the big things that Elliott and I will always advocate as well is recognizing the intersectionality and the co-occurrence with neurodivergent conditions. There is a lot of gender diversity and a lot of co-occurrence in terms of other medical conditions, other neurocognitive and psychological conditions as well, anxiety, depression. We have a constellation of autoimmune and chronic pain and all of these kinds of things. So people might be experiencing challenges on a number of different levels simultaneously on top of a neurodivergent condition as they kind of navigate the world. Anything you wanted to add to that, Elliott?
Not for this one, I think, although I think just reiterating that being kind is a good way to go about things.
But moving to the classroom specifically, we've kind of talked about a couple of these things already, and these, again, not exhaustive, just nice guiding principles to kind of start this conversation and to start the wheels turning. But communication, clear and unambiguous communication in the classroom is going to benefit absolutely every single student, not just neurodivergent ones. Funneling the amount of information to key points, minimizing extraneous materials and all of that kind of stuff. Tailoring tasks as much as possible and responsibilities to particular strengths. This is something that I try and do with group work tasks, is to really subdivide a task into roles and then designate, if you like these things, if you're really good at these things, you should take this role within the group. Really making explicit what responsibilities and tasks people can take to facilitate intergroup communication and to facilitate progress. Being very explicit about working patterns and expectations. This is something that I'm very clear about with my dissertation students in particular. But a couple of things that might be relevant to neurodivergent people are things like pathological demand avoidance. So looking at a really big task can be so overwhelming and can just lead to the most pathological level of procrastination that you can imagine. So breaking down tasks into achievable milestones and taking over that single overwhelming presence of something into something that can be achieved in a much more manageable way can be really effective for people, particularly PGR students who are looking at that distant dissertation and dreading in fear. Something else in terms of not just communication, but nonverbal things and things written in text is being aware of differences in emotion regulation, particularly within education contexts, feedback. We've done some recent research looking at feedback literacy and how it's impacted by emotion regulation and rejection sensitivity in particular. And it really can limit people's ability to first engage with feedback, have that level of cognitive reappraisal to actually use it, and then to actually implement it. So being mindful of tone in spoken communication and in written communication, how that can be misinterpreted, and giving feedback in the most constructive way possible. And it's something I obsess over when I'm giving feedback myself. Like, how could this be misinterpreted? How could this be negatively interpreted just by the slip of a tone or the use of a particular word? But it's also related to the level of anticipation that somebody might have in advance of feedback coming. Hopefully that research will be published soon. But also flexible environments and optional engagement is really important too. Elliott, did you want to speak to that one perhaps?
Yeah, I would. And I think that ties in with some of the things that we've learned from the pandemic, the pivot to online, some things that we can take forward. One thing that I've noticed overwhelmingly is that students are participating a lot more via text chat. So for example, in Zoom, we have the chat function, as is demonstrated here. Lots of people are contributing really useful, relevant, and interesting things. And for everyone, but particularly for neurodivergent people, it can be difficult figuring out what the right time is to contribute in conversation, and even if there is a good time at all to contribute. And being able to contribute in the chat right there means that somebody can do that without worrying that they're interrupting, and also without having to have quite such a spotlight on them as having to speak. And part of my job is observing colleagues doing teaching. And I've noticed again and again that just students are engaging so much more by typing in the chat than they had done previously. Now, that is not to say that the only way for a student to engage is for them to be typing or speaking or visibly saying things. Students can be engaging just by sitting and thinking. And I think that's partly what we're talking about here with optional engagement. So often something that I hear is, well, people should be pushed out of their comfort zone. That's what university is for. But unfortunately, at least my feeling is that that notion of a comfort zone is often quite a neurotypically designed comfort zone. And in fact, what educators are often saying when they say that is, I think I should be pushing neurodivergent people to mask and behave in a way I would expect of neurotypical people. And that can be very difficult and traumatic. Even if somebody can perform to that, it could be highly distressing. They might receive just the same academic mark, but it could be a very highly distressing experience for them. And so if it is a situation where it's not really necessary for everyone to obviously contribute, then you can set a task where somebody can just reflect on something for a few minutes. You can give a task where for 5 minutes people can think about it and take notes if they like, rather than always putting people in groups, for example, to have discussions. Group work, as Chiara has mentioned, it can be one area where it's particularly difficult for neurodivergent people. So things like that, and having lecture recordings available. I think Amy was saying in the chat that the ability to watch recordings at your own speed can be really helpful. So just things like that, it's nice to be able to take forward. When it comes to curriculum, obviously it's a very big topic. One approach that could be really helpful is universal design for learning. Now, there's a good paper on this that we've linked to from the Linktree page, and it's a review of lots of different papers that are looking into this particular framework. The idea of universal design for learning is that rather than just responding to individual adjustments or accommodations that you know students need, it's trying to proactively design your curriculum in a way that is going to be better for everyone. Now, of course, that sounds like a great idea, but it doesn't in itself give a lot of tips as to how you would go about it. So there is actually a framework which has lots and lots of different ideas about what you can do. And it talks about having multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. And what that is not just having one way of trying to get students excited about something, not just having one type of person that's always depicted in case studies and examples, and not just having one way that students can interact. And there's various ways of going about this. You could use a variety of different approaches throughout a course, or you could have different options for people to do at the same time. Giving too much choice can, of course, be quite upsetting in itself. It can be quite anxiety provoking. So it can be a bit difficult to balance, but just saying, hi, this is the task, but if people prefer, they could do this instead, is quite a nice way to go about things. And it also balances with that idea of just trying not to take it personally, trying not to act too defensively if somebody says, wow, that really doesn't work for me, that's really hard. One particular way of thinking about this can be in relation to constructive alignment, which is the idea that when you're designing courses, the way that you assess what you're assessing should be what it is that you'd like students to be able to do by the end of the course. And that should link in with the intended learning outcomes, which are what you've said are the things you want students to be able to do by the end of the course. And joining those two things are the teaching activities, which should help students to be able to develop those skills. And for you as an educator and for students to be aware of those things throughout means that they can self-regulate and you can help them to get an idea of how they're developing those skills. But also thinking about those intended learning outcomes can help you think, right, is there flexibility here in how this is demonstrated? So an example of that would be, if you always have a presentation at the end, for example, because you think it's really important that students can learn to communicate, it's thinking, okay, that's great, but is a presentation the only way for someone to be able to develop and demonstrate good communication? And so it's really just about engaging critically with the idea of standards and what we mean by that. And I'll pass on to Chiara for the last part of this.
Something that I came across recently that I think is a nice additional consideration on top of universal design for learning is something called culturally relevant pedagogy. That was first suggested in terms of neurodivergence by Schmalsky, Gobo, and Witt very recently. And it's taking a pedagogical approach that was developed for kind of racial and cultural contexts and communities and applying that to the neurodivergent community itself, because in and of itself, that community has a culture very much online and offline. And this is really talking about involving this within the curriculum specifically. So first of all, looking at how you can support academic success for neurodivergent people within your curriculum through something like universal design for learning, but also building into the curriculum and the classroom this idea of cultural respect for the idea of neurodivergence, educating students to be accepting and aware of neurocognitive differences, and to examine society with this level of critical consciousness and societal awareness. It's a fairly new suggestion. I don't have an example of how it's yet been implemented, but I think it's something that has a great deal of potential for us as educators to think about in terms of our contexts and our courses. We've got one more little bubble. I'm conscious of the time. A lot of these things that we've already talked about, but something I want to reiterate here is that there's only so much that individuals can do. This does rely on a systems and a cultural change in education more broadly that is really going to be, that's really the gatekeeper for a lot of change and a lot of progress on this kind of issue. But there are some things that we can still do as individuals. I've highlighted a couple of these already. Neurodiversity training from neurodivergent people, participatory and collaborative design, either through research or through curriculums involving neurodivergent people and students within that conversation. Incorporating potentially parent-peer support or the disabled students allowance, non-medical helper support can bring really nice individualized support to a person on top of university style provision through disability services. Really identifying an individual student's challenges, barriers to their engagement or their education and their strengths. Disambiguating things as much as humanly possible. And aside from a couple of other practical things that we've already talked about, preparing and sharing in advance. As we know from the pivot to online learning, that helps all of our students to have preparation, flexibility, to reduce anxiety, to give more processing time, and to reduce environmental challenges as well. But fostering psychologically safe spaces, diversifying teaching practice, and scaffolding a lot of our activities are also going to be really helpful. And the last point, have high expectations of your neurodivergent students. Please don't have any other expectations than you would have for any other student. They may be experiencing more challenges, but they can achieve just as much in spite of those. So I will come out of this now. So you can see our little link tree here at the bottom, once my screen is good. Linktree/neurodiv for a link to some of the resources that we've talked about. If you are a Glasgow student or staff member, there's also a link to the Teams for the Neurodiversity Network. You're welcome to join. If you are outside of Glasgow, just send Elliott and I an email, and we can still add you to the Neurodiversity Network. If you'd like to be involved, you're more than welcome to. And Elliott is very active on Twitter. I am less active on Twitter. I just share photos of my cats, but I am still there every now and again. So feel free to come and say hello. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Chiara and Elliott, for this. I think the feedback from the chat is overwhelmingly positive. We had a lot of, conversations between attendees, so fantastic. And thank you for making this very clear and providing us with really hands-on suggestions and recommendations for teaching. And that's absolutely fantastic. I will open the floor now for any questions you might have. So you can raise your hand and just say your question out loud or put the question in the chat. It's absolutely up to you. Anything that springs to mind?
Something that I find helpful to get my students to do is, if you're going to type something that's quite long and you want to make sure we don't just go away, if you type like a few dots into the chat, then we'll know that you're typing something to say, because it doesn't show us, like Chiara is typing like it would in a lot of pieces of software.
That's a good suggestion, actually.
Thank you.
You sound surprised.
Finally, a good suggestion.
Jude.
Hi, that was so interesting, and I am just so keen to learn more. And I was really engaged at the beginning when you mentioned that the first person is typically favoured, and we touched on it in the chat, but I just wondered if either of you would be willing to expand and explain a little bit more about why that perspective tends to be favoured, please.
Yeah, I mean, one of the Elliott is the autistic of the two of us, so I will let him kind of speak a little bit more. But generally, it's that people can't separate their autism from who they are as an individual. So it's not something they carry with them. Sorry, it is a part of who they are fundamentally, and that's why the identity first is preferred by not everybody, but by the vast majority of autistic people.
That's super clear. Thank you so much for answering my question.
I have another question in the chat from Zeba. They ask, can I ask whether neurodivergent educators found the pivot easier to teach?
I don't think anyone found anything easy about the pivot. I mean, yes and no. I found it quite an adjustment to shift, but then once I was cats that scream all the time, but I did kind of find then I hadn't eaten or drunk or anything like that, so there was a dark side to that level of adaptability as well. But it's really hard to extrapolate because it was such an extreme period of stress for everyone. It was an alternative reality that I don't know if I would be able to generalize outside of it. What about you, Elliott?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can't speak on behalf of all neurodivergent educators. That would be quite an impressive thing if we had a hive mind like that. For me, yeah, I mean, for me, it's been extremely positive from a work perspective. For me, I'm also physically disabled. And so for me, being able to work from home at all has made things a lot easier for me. And I suppose also, and whether this is related to my neurodiversity or not, I generally find it easier to do things online rather than in person. And so I grew up as a teenager on a Lord of the Rings chat room. So, I do generally find that. And because I work in technology enhanced learning as well, I think I was already doing quite a lot of online teaching. So I think that probably did give me a bit of a heads up. Yeah.
Yeah, I think recording lectures for me, I found that more comfortable because, once the lambs stop screaming in my head when I'm in an in-person lecture theatre, 45 minutes have passed of me being hysterically mode of mouthing, but with a recording, I can be like, okay, 15 minutes, take a break, check that you're happy with it. And if you need to, I rarely had to re-record something, but just the pressure of knowing that I could, if I wanted to, was a safe space, I guess.
I think we had a hand raised by Jennifer. Did the question?
Yeah, I've got a question. You've mentioned quite a few times about the curriculum, and then you moved on to talking about universal design for learning. I'm just wondering what strategies you would use with educators. I mean, I'm from Sheffield Hallam, and we've been talking about universal design for learning for about 4 years, and I'm working with our Department for Academic Development and Diversity on an inclusive curriculum framework. So what sort of strategies would you work with educators on to actually look at UDL?
I think the challenge is, the paper that is on the link tree is really good at talking about this, is that it's not an intervention really in itself, it's a lens for how to view potential changes. And so it's kind of, you could do anything if you had, and call it UDL if universal design for learning was the sort of ideological framework you were going through. I would say that those pillars are a good place to start. So the multiple means of different things, and on the couple of websites that have been linked there, there's a list of strategies underneath each of the pillars. So for universal design for learning, there'll be things underneath there. But in my opinion, there isn't kind of one set of easy things to do. It's more about finding out in what different ways we make assumptions and how those are impacting our students, and how we can deviate from things that rely on those assumptions. So I'm afraid I don't have the easiest answer, but I would say that for universal design for learning, the CAST website, which is listed there, and the ahead.ie website are both really good resources.
One other quick question, because you're talking about education, higher education, what about neurodivergent staff?
I think Chiara might have something to say. I mean, I think that is a massive topic in itself, but probably not one we have
not
time
one for
to
today.
Go into
I was going to say, probably
but
not
no, but it is
today.
very important, and it's something that I think both Chiara and I are both very interested in working on further.
Yeah, thank you.
David, you had your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Great information there, Elliott and Chiara. I just wanted to emphasize this idea, relatively new for me, of the idea of demand avoidance and rejection sensitivity in neurodiversity, especially, of course, in ADHD. But as we know, a lot of autistic people have co-occurring ADHD as well. Have you got any other tips about avoiding that? You talked, Chiara, about being very careful with the way you give feedback as part of that. But are there any other sort of traps to avoid if you're trying to be sensitive to those things?
It's kind of a difficult thing because we can only kind of do so much as providers of feedback. I think sometimes the challenge with rejection sensitivity is very much individualized and internal to the recipient. I know some people have talked about using voice notes, either on Teams. I do that for efficiency on Teams when I'm talking to students sometimes, but tools like Turnitin, you can add feedback by text, and then you can add a short voice note, and sometimes just that tone can help disambiguate potentially critical feedback within kind of assessments. I was presenting to the counselling and mental health services group here at Glasgow once. They were asking me how it could potentially interplay into kind of a counselling or therapy session. And that is something that's so far beyond my expertise. But they were really interested in how to wrap up a session without, kind of triggering any kind of feeling of rejection sensitivity. But a lot of it, from what we found in this most recent study in terms of feedback literacy and academic feedback, is the anticipation was a really significant part of it. But a lot of it was balanced and ameliorated by the relationship with the tutor. So having that personal relationship and having a positive relationship was very much a protective factor, and reduced a lot of that anxiety So I think making sure that a marker is known and isn't a surprise is going to be very helpful. Having that positive relationship with students and having them know you as an individual rather than just, you know, a name on a course or a photo on a course is quite helpful in that regard. But there is only so much that we can do in terms of, you know, we can only control what we can control. And there still might be an interpretation that comes from the recipient, regardless of how much we try and avoid that.
It's also worth keeping in mind the amount of emotional labor that this can often put on us as educators. I know that Chiara and I are both find giving feedback very emotional because we're worried about triggering that sort of thing in people. And so I have written a small opinion piece on that in the past, which you can find by searching my name and, I don't know, emotional labor and feedback. But it does really hit on both sides. There is something else, I suppose, when it comes to in classroom teaching as well as feedback, David, and that's just, and I'm sure that you don't do this anyway, but just down to not being dismissive if a student gives what might be an incorrect answer, or if they, generally, I think the big thing here is that often when neurodivergent students are just being themselves, other educators might think, oh, they're being disrespectful, they're being bad, and I need to discipline that because I'm doing classroom management. And unfortunately, that can be massively ableist. And so it's sort of about giving students the benefit of the doubt and trying to not immediately like tell them off, as it were. I'm sure that none of us are doing that, but it's just something that's good to keep in mind.
I was just thinking that, you know, we were talking about neurodivergent staff, and so the autistic tendency to be forthright might really interact with that neurodivergent tendency to be sensitive to rejection.
You may have witnessed that in me already, David.
Yeah, I mean, as Elliott mentioned, I think the intersection between neurodivergent staff giving feedback, like the emotional toll and just the length of time it can take, I've found, for me to provide feedback that I'm happy with, that I'm not going to lie awake at 3 a.m. and go, oh my God, they're going to totally misrepresent what I was trying to say. Like, it's so much additional labor. But yeah, we've got a study kind of in the works at the moment, looking at how staff receive things like EVASIS or, you know, student evaluation feedback. And part of that will obviously be also giving feedback to and the expectations around that. So there's definitely a lot to look into.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we have another hand raised, and I don't see the name, I just see a number. So you're welcome to unmute and ask a question. Or not. You're still there. Because I don't know how to do this, if there's any. No. Is there any other?
Sorry.
Oh, there we go. No,
it takes me a while to unmute. The stylus doesn't work that well. Okay, this is Marion from Glasgow.
Hi.
A couple of sort of comments. I think in terms of the issues of feedback, that in some ways is relevant to all students, not just neurodivergent students, that anything you say, you know, can be quite devastating. I also find that with feedback, if I'm commenting on some completed work, I'll try and make it more balanced, whereas if a student has sent me, you know, a draft of something to comment on, then obviously I'm going to focus on the things they need to change, but possibly should make it clearer that I'm doing that and, you know, why I'm doing that, and not to take it out of context. I think also I mean, obviously we all, you know, people have a diversity of needs, and therefore there can sometimes, you know, sometimes a sort of good practice which is useful to everyone and sometimes something which, you know, there can be conflict. Like, I put, you know, I'm also neurodivergent. And when I teach online, because it's more accessible for me to have audio only, it means I then require assistance to show slides and so on. And there may be disadvantages to students who can't see me. Mm-hmm. It also means I don't have access to the chat. Mm-hmm. But equally, I get the impression that if I did, and put this in for some other neurodivergent people, it would just be, it's not, I get the impression that, you know, the text moves and I can't deal with scrolling text. So there's sort of complex issues of how you deal with people having different needs, and sort of if you avoiding focusing on one issue and then avoid the sort of other issues or the wider context, if that makes sense.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I do agree with you that it's a good idea to be critical of the idea that universal design for learning means that something will always be better for everyone. And actually there's some papers that within the review that I mentioned that do critique that idea. I would agree with you completely. I offer one, and it is about trying to make a balance. But as Marion says, that can be really difficult.
Yeah, and to your first point, Marion, as well, I very much have to preface when I'm giving draft feedback to my supervisees that I love to copy edit, and I just go into a tunnel, and there will be a lot of red edited text, and that's not a reflection on them. They can either confirm or disregard as they like. But yeah, as long as we're very declarative and we are very clear about what it is we are giving feedback to and why, I've only had a positive response to that myself. So I think just those conversations and that honesty is really important.
The challenge that I don't have an answer to is that, you know, if you do balance it, you know, too much, then if it's an assignment that hasn't really met the criteria, then people will be in touch saying, well, this sounded quite positive. I don't understand why I got this grade. And personally, I feel like that on top of all of everything else can just be a real challenge.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you so much, Marion, for your questions and your comments.
Just before, Manny would like to make an announcement, if that's okay, about a Glasgow neurodivergent society that's about to start, if that's okay.
Hi, my name is Manny. I am a postgraduate student in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. And for this academic year, we as students are looking to start a neurodiversity society. So if there's anyone who is a student at the University of Glasgow, postgraduate or undergraduate, you may join. We still are under the membership count of 15. We basically started working on this since last Sunday, and we hope to have our first events by the end of this month. I'm about to send a Facebook group link in the chat, and hopefully soon enough there will also be a registration in the Facebook group for where people can put down their student ID and email and stuff for the SRC registration as well. We should also have a EGM coming up soon as well. So if anyone wants to contribute a bit more to our society, feel free to attend that. And yeah, so yeah.
Thank you. It's very helpful. Yeah, we will also add the link then to the actual post, where we will have the recording and any other links that were shared. Yeah, I would like to thank Chiara and Elliott for coming here today, for your talk and presentation, and for answering all the questions. It was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much.